Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good to see a nice turnout here from across the region. My name is Duncan Whittick, and I'm the Operations Coordinator for the Kootenay Conservation Program, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. For those of you who don't know, the Kootenay Conservation Program, or the KCP, is a broad partnership of organizations from across the Kootenays. And we work to conserve landscapes that sustain naturally functioning ecosystems. And you can find out more about our organization at kootenayconservation.ca. So today is our second webinar in our 5-part winter webinar series. This webinar series is hosted in partnership with the Columbia Basin Watershed Network. And the Watershed Network acts as a regional umbrella network for organizations working on watershed stewardship to share experiences and resources and build knowledge and expertise in the Canadian Columbia Basin. We're really excited about this partnership as it's an opportunity for both organizations to bring together our membership and build capacity amongst water and conservation groups across the region. So in addition to today's webinar, we have 4 other webinars. The first one we had was on salmon in the Columbia Basin. And that one is now available at kootenayconservation.ca. And I apologize, this is the first webinar that I've hosted, so you have to bear with me. I'm just looking to see if this screen is sharing still. Okay, so hopefully we're back there. We do have another 3 webinars after this one. We've got freshwater storytelling on Thursday, January 15th by David Minko of the Canadian Freshwater Alliance. We've got a webinar on biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification on February 12th. And we've got one on emerging issues in mountain watershed management on Tuesday, March 5th. So if you haven't already, feel free to register for those at kootenayconservation.ca/webinar or www.cbwn.ca/dev/webinar. So a few things before we begin. Like I said, I will be administering the webinar, so if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box. We've received over 40 registrants for this session. So you'll notice that participants have been placed on a blanket mute. This has been done to avoid background noise and feedback. If you lose your connection or are removed from the webinar for any reason, please click on the link that was provided when you registered, and it should plug you back into the session. The webinar will be about an hour in length, and you're welcome to post questions throughout the presentation, but we will wait to address them for a couple of planned question periods. And the webinar will be recorded and available on our website following the presentation. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to our second webinar in our series, Identifying and Investing in Resilient Landscapes. This webinar is presented by Dr. Steve Buttrick, who is the Director of Conservation Science and Planning for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. Dr. Buttrick received a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Vegetation Ecology and Remote Sensing. He has a Master's in Science from the Ohio State University in Botany and Arctic Ecology, and a Bachelor's in Zoology from the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Buttrick began working for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon in 1999, and as Director of Conservation Science and Planning, he oversees the Conservancy's GIS monitoring, planning, and climate change programs and initiatives. Lately, he and his program have been focused on eco-regional planning, mapping connectivity, and assessing and mapping landscape resilience in the Pacific Northwest U.S. He is responsible for helping the Nature Conservancy's strategies for addressing the threats to Oregon's biological diversity at a site and multi-site scales, developing and maintaining cooperative management programs and partnerships, and building stewardship capacity with key federal, state, community, and private partners. He has been working for the Nature Conservancy since 1978 and has served in science, stewardship, and management positions at the Conservancy's Worldwide Office and Eastern Regional Office. So, without further ado, I will pass the presentation over to Steve.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm hoping you can. Duncan, can I hear you?
Yeah, I can hear you at this end, so hopefully that means everybody else can too.
Okay. And I guess everyone can see my screen.
Looks like
I want everyone to know that I have lost weight since that picture was taken, so it doesn't accurately reflect me. I want to thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. It is work that I have been involved in heavily for the past couple years. As Duncan said, I do work for the Nature Conservancy. Been with them since 1978. I've been in Oregon here since 1999. I did get a PhD at the University of British Columbia, where I worked on vegetation classification and mapping on an island, on a mountain on an island in Atlin Lake. And then it was a great experience. I spent 3 summers camped above tree line there. So if you've ever been to Atlin, just look down the lake and you'll see my mountain. Anyway, okay, let me make sure I'm all set here. Okay, good. What I wanted to cover first was just a little bit about the Nature Conservancy and how we have done conservation planning on an ecoregion by ecoregion basis, and the work that has been done by us and by Nature Conservancy Canada for the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And then I want to move into climate change, how that has impacted ecoregional assessments or will impact ecoregional assessments, and get into our idea of conserving nature's stage. I do want to emphasize that this is a terrestrial focus, so I apologize for those of you who are interested in aquatics and riverine work, but this is a terrestrial resilience study. Then I want to get into some of the methods we used, and from there into the application of results. And I will, if time permits, stop in a few places to allow some questions to be asked. And there is something going on outside my window, and I hope that the noise of that is not picking up too much. So the Nature Conservancy's mission is to preserve the plants, animals, and natural communities that represent the diversity of life on Earth by protecting lands and waters they need to survive. And we have been doing that by planning on an ecoregion by ecoregion basis rather than a state by state basis. We usually work on a state-by-state basis, but a lot of the planning is on by ecoregions. And we have first iterations of ecoregional plans for all ecoregions in North America. And the Canadian, as I said, the Canadian Nature Conservancy has been involved or taken the lead in the ecoregional assessments for the ecoregions that are in Canada. An ecoregional assessment is a spatially explicit assessment for addressing conservation needs of all biodiversity in the ecoregion. We're focused on all biodiversity, and it establishes goals and priorities for the ecoregions in which we invest resources. The key concepts of an ecoregional assessment, and I'm going over this because there has been a really good ecoregional assessment done for the Canadian Rockies, which you fall in the middle of. And if you're not aware of it, this is it's a good opportunity to learn more because it's a great resource. And if you are aware of it, maybe this can be a little refresher. But the key concepts of an ecoregional assessment is that it is focused on all biodiversity. And we do this by focusing and inventorying and mapping terrestrial, freshwater, and marine habitats, with the idea that if you can conserve multiple representative examples of all terrestrial, freshwater, and marine habitats, you're probably going to capture 90–95% of all of the biodiversity within that ecoregion. And the species that fall out, that don't get protected with that approach, are the rare ones, and so we inventory and map the rare species also, and that is a fine filter. It's important to realize that the ecoregional assessment covers, well, it also addresses multiple occurrences, so we're not after like Noah's proverbial pair of everything. We're after multiple populations of each of the species and multiple hectares of the communities. It addresses all ownerships, doesn't matter who owns it. It's a wall-to-wall assessment, and the product is a network of conservation areas. We call them portfolio sites. Some people call them conservation opportunity areas. But these areas minimize the cost and maximize the representation of all of the biodiversity that we're trying to capture. So the method is to first select conservation targets. So we identify all of the communities and aquatic communities that occur within that ecoregion and map them, and we identify the species and maybe rare plant communities that occur within that ecoregion, and we map those from multiple sources, and especially from the conservation data centers like the CDC in British Columbia. We then set conservation goals for each of these conservation targets. So a target is like a species or a community. And the conservation goal simply says that for a rare species, do we want to capture all of the populations or all of the occurrences of that species? Do we want to capture 50% of the populations? It has to do with how rare that species is in the ecoregion. And we also ask how much of each ecological system or habitat we want to capture, and we have usually set a goal of 30% of the existing distribution that we want to get within our portfolio or conservation opportunity areas. We also want to make sure that we are identifying species and systems that are dispersed across the ecoregion. In other words, if we're capturing 30% of ponderosa pine forests, we want that to be scattered across their distribution and not just in the, say, in the southeast corner of the ecoregion. We then take the ecoregion, we divide it into assessment units. Usually the assessment units are watersheds, small watersheds, 6-field hucks that are about average 20 to 40,000 acres. I'll let you convert that to hectares. And then we map all of the conservation targets within these assessment units. We also, within each assessment unit, we calculate or look at how suitable it is for conservation. So we would look at how much of that assessment unit is already protected. We would look at land ownership patterns, how much is private, how much is public. It might be easier to protect an assessment unit if it's public land versus private land, or at least it would cost less. We look at the land use. We look at what the density of roads are. We look at how much agriculture there is, other human development. And so we assess really the kind of the condition of that assessment unit, which again is a small watershed. Then we take all of that information, run it through a program called MARXAN, M-A-R-X-A-N, and it spits out a conservation portfolio. And what it does is it does its best to meet all of the goals. In fact, if you tell it to, it will meet all of the goals that you have set for the conservation targets. It does that simultaneously while trying to minimize the number of assessment units that it identifies. So in this case, the watershed. So it minimizes the area, and it optimizes the suitability of those assessment areas. So it's looking for those that are in best condition and have good ownership patterns. And then the product is a portfolio of sites. So all of these green blobs represent portfolios that were developed during ecoregional assessment. And it certainly doesn't mean that anyone is going to protect all of these. The area is huge, but these areas could and should be managed, at least, with the needs of targets in mind. So it shows us how to get the most bang for our conservation buck if we're spending money. It creates a shared conservation vision among conservation practitioners and partners. And it points us to the best places to do biodiversity conservation work. Now, as I said, the ecoregions that are in Canada, including the Canadian Rockies, the Nature Conservancy of Canada was the lead. It was done in collaboration with us, with a lot of provincial partners and state partners, and I don't know if there were any federal partners, but a number of partners were involved, and you can view and download all of these assessments if you go to the Nature Conservancy site, click on what we do, go to the Resource Center, and then click on Conservation Blueprints, and then you can download it. The reports are pretty big. Canadian Rockies, 29 megabytes. This is just the cover of one of the 4 volumes of the Canadian Rockies, and it's the volume that includes all of the maps. And there are a lot of maps, but this is one of the final maps that shows the conservation portfolio within the Canadian Rockies. And as you can see, although a lot of the portfolio sites are small, most of them are big, and it does capture a large percent of the Canadian Rockies. In fact, the U.S. portion here, the portfolio captures, I think, 62% of the land area, which is more than we usually capture. And within the assessment, each of these sites are given a number or a code, and you can look those up and find a lot of information on them, including what the targets were, what the ownership is, what the threats are to that area, what the management issues are, conservation opportunities, stakeholders involved, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a really good resource for people doing conservation work in the Canadian Rockies. And forgive me if you're all using this and I've just preached to the choir. So, but if you're not, I would urge you to get in touch or try to get that. And this again is the picture of all portfolio sites within the area, the ecoregion. So we have the Canadian Rockies, Middle Rockies, Blue Mountains, Columbia Plateau. You'll know what this is, but I forget what it is. And Northern Cascades and the like. I was going to stop for questions, but I think maybe I will continue on. But feel free to jot questions down regarding that. So the issue now is that we have been doing this planning, and we have been doing this planning based on where species and communities are now. And we know that with climate change, where they are now is very likely not where they're going to be in the future. We have not directly addressed climate change in these ecoregional assessments. I would say that the Canadian Rockies did one of the better jobs because they identified sites that were actually corridors. And so they made an effort to create corridor sites between some of their larger sites. But the other ecoregions did not. We are looking at trying to spread conservation over a wide area, so that might mediate the effect of climate change, but it was not done directly and with purpose. So the issue with climate change, one of the issues, and everyone knows this, is that there is a lot of uncertainty as to exactly how the climate's going to change and where it is going to be changing. So how much and where. This is a report out of the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and you can see that there is just a lot of variation, especially in terms of precipitation. That's the hardest to get our heads around, where between now and 2080, they are estimating that precipitation will either decrease 10% or could increase up to 20%. So and who knows where. So it's very hard to plan based on these projections. I mean, my weatherman had a hard time forecasting the weather today. He got it wrong. This was yesterday, and so it's really hard to really try to figure out what the climate's going to be in 50, 80, 100 years from now. That said, there are a number of projects ongoing that are modeling climate and trying to apply that to species distributions. Excuse me. One of them is the Pacific Northwest Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, and you can access this under www.climatevulnerability.org. And the study area for this assessment includes Kootenai, so it does include your geography. I honestly don't know how up to date it is. It's been in process for a number of years now. One of the things that they have developed is a climate sensitivity database that is looking at how sensitive each species is to climate change. Some are very sensitive, some are less sensitive, and you can look that up for species you're interested in. They're also creating habitat suitability models, which is looking at historic distribution of a species, relating that to the current distribution of a species, and then projecting future distribution of a species based on climate suitability. And they say they're doing this for 350 terrestrial animals, 11 tree species, and 100 ecosystems. So this is all well and good, and it's really valuable information. But one of the problems with it, and I would suggest you use it, but one of the issues, of course, is the issue associated with the modeling of climate change, in that you're kind of starting out with highly uncertain emission scenarios. You don't know what emissions are going to look like over the next 50 or 100 years. So you have multiple emission scenarios, and then you apply those emissions scenarios to multiple very uncertain ocean global circulation models. So you've added to the uncertainty. And then with the results of those global models, we are now downscaling information to square kilometers and sometimes even 30 meter pixels. And you can imagine how inaccurate that information is. I mean, it might give you a general snapshot of what's happening, but it's not very accurate. And then we're using that information to model climate envelopes for species. So it is difficult to plan around climate change. The other problem with this kind of work is that it is being done species by species, and that, of course, is a lot of work. So that brings us now to main topic, and yikes, I'm at 10:30 my time already. And that is identifying a resilient network of conservation lands in the Northwest. And we are calling this conserving the stage or conserving nature's stage. And the idea here is that we're doing this work without any climate modeling. So it doesn't matter what the climate does. This work is aimed at identifying a resilient network of conservation lands. It is based strictly on geophysical features that will not change with climate change. So I'm going to describe, first of all, the concept of this approach. And it's one that aims to identify key areas for conservation, as I said, based strictly on land characteristics that can increase resilience and maintain biodiversity. Resilience is a hard word to define, but in this case we're using resilience to refer to the capacity of a site or a landscape or even a region to adapt to climate change while still maintaining species diversity. We do not assume that the species currently located at the sites or at the landscapes or within the region will necessarily be the same species present in a century or two, but they will, there will still be species if the area is resilient. So managing for resilient focuses on increasing flexibility and the ability of species to adapt and self-organize in response to change. Now, our project objective is to, or has been to identify the most resilient sites in the Northwest that will collectively and individually best sustain native biodiversity even as the climate changes and alters the distribution patterns of those species in order to guide future conservation investment. And it is based on two assumptions. The first assumption, I want you to remember these, the first assumption is that geophysical features, the physical features of the landscape, underlie the spatial distribution of biodiversity. And a region's biological richness is due in part to this geophysical diversity. So geophysical features and the mapping and distribution of those geophysical features, I'm going to argue, is really critical. There are a lot of reasons why species occur, you know, where they occur. Where they occur is a function of natural processes, wind, herbivory, fire, flooding, and the like. It's also a response of an interaction among species. Where species occur is certainly a function of what the climate is, temperature, precipitation, the highs and lows, the seasonality of that climate. But it's also a function of the geophysical aspects of their environment, including things like elevation, geology, soil, latitude aspect, slope aspect, things like that. All of the things that impact where species occur, they will all change with climate change except for the geophysical aspects. And so these geophysical aspects are really important. And that information has been empirically tested in the northeastern U.S. and eastern Canada by colleagues of mine in the Nature Conservancy in the East. And they did an analysis of what was really responsible for the diversity, that is the number of total species within each state and within the eastern Canadian provinces. They looked at climate factors, They looked at physical factors. They looked at latitudinal factors and the like. And the ones that best predicted how many species would occur within a state or a province were geology, the number of geology types that were found within that state or province, the elevation range within that state or province, and the latitudinal range of that state or province. And they were able to, given information on the number of geologic types, the elevation range, the latitudinal range, they were able to calculate or predict the number of species that would occur, and that number of species matched almost exactly the actual number of species that were found there. I think they're dealing with vertebrates and plants, but I'm not sure. So they're essentially saying that the higher the number of these geophysical features, the higher the number of species. And we've called the combination of these geophysical features land facets. So I'm going to be referring to land facets a lot. So the higher the number of land facets, the higher the number of species. And it suggests that although the individual ranges of many species may shift with climate change, that the spatial pattern of total biodiversity will remain associated with these enduring geophysical properties. So that maybe you could actually say, we will try to protect examples of all of these land facets. And in that way, we will have captured the proverbial stage upon which these species move around. It's another coarse filter in addition to communities. There is a lot of research and papers that have been published on this concept, conserving the stage, use of land facets, protecting the geophysical setting, all of that show that people are really thinking in this way. And we are using the analogy of conserving nature's stage, where you can think of each land facet as a stage, and the species are the players on that stage. And as a play ends, the players are going to move to another stage. Some of the players will stay. New players will move on to that stage. But as long as they have the stages, they will be able to continue to perform their plays. Maybe a silly analogy, but that's kind of what we're talking about. Some people also use baseball parks and baseball players, but that's the concept. So the other assumption, the first assumption was that geophysical diversity impacts species diversity. The second assumption is that microclimate diversity and local permeability, that is lack of fragmentation, convey a level of resilience to a landscape or site. And I will explain what I mean. So the more landforms there are within an area, the more microclimates there are. Landforms control the distribution of moisture and nutrients and climatic effects. Ridges are frequently drier, sometimes colder. North slopes might be colder, south slopes wetter. As you move down into toe slopes, it might get wetter, and valleys are wetter, and the like. So if you can capture a lot of the microclimate diversity, the diversity of landforms here, it gives more options for species to move and find an appropriate niche as the climate changes. So it essentially is a kind of a micro-refugia. It just slows down species leaving the site completely. So more heterogeneity, more options for species to move and rearrange at a given site. And again, there's a lot of research that is documenting this, and I can send you links to some of these papers. Now, the other thing is that if you have a really diverse landscape with a lot of microclimates, a lot of topographic diversity, it doesn't do any good if the species can't take advantage of that. And so if that landscape is fragmented and the species can't move, then the value of that microclimate diversity is minimized. So we're looking not only for areas that have higher microclimate diversity, but we're also looking for areas that are permeable for species movement or minimize fragmentation. So a relatively fragmented landscape here with agriculture and development and roads, and relatively permeable or unfragmented landscape here. So our central assumption then is that by mapping key land facets and evaluating all occurrences for characteristics that buffer against climate change, we can identify the representative settings that are the most resilient. So essentially we're trying to identify resilient examples of each of the land facets. So we want to protect examples of all of the land facets, and those examples we protect, we want them to be have these characteristics that might make them more resilient to climate change. I was going to stop for questions here, but now I'm not going to. I'm going to continue on. Sorry. So I want to get into methods, actually how we went about doing this, and I will try to keep it brief and not too technical since I get all mixed up with the technical aspects of it myself. So there was a project that was funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation in 2012 that was called Conserving the Stage, Identifying a Resilient Network of Conservation Lands in the Northwest. And they wanted us to work on using this process that I just described, which has been developed in the eastern U.S. The Duke Foundation is very interested in this because they invest in land. They spend a lot of money acquiring land for conservation purposes, and they want some assurance that their investments are going to have long-term impact. So the area that we did this work in is the ecoregions east of the Cascade in the Pacific Northwest. It included all of the East Cascades, Modoc Plateau, included all of the Columbia Plateau. It included all of the Middle Rockies, Blue Mountains, and, I apologize, it included only the U.S. portion of the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And that simply had to do with the amount of time we had and compatibility of data across country boundaries. So this area was 67 million hectares, and the first thing we needed to do was to identify what geophysical factors we were going to combine to create land facets. And as I said, in the east, they used geology types. They had 9 geology types. And they used elevation. And they used latitude. We're assuming latitude because we're looking at different ecoregions that differ in their latitudinal extent. So for the features that we were going to overlay on top of each other in order to create these land facets, a simple overlay process, we asked, well, should we use geology or should we use soil? And the East Coast used geology. They found that vegetation sorted itself very well based on geology. We found that vegetation in the Northwest did not, and that soil was a better predictor of the mosaic of vegetation, that vegetation pattern. So we decided to use soil order. We also looked at elevation and made a decision as to whether we were going to use 10 300-meter elevation breaks or 6 600-meter elevation breaks. We went for the 6 600-meter breaks just simply because they were fewer breaks, and it would create fewer land facets to have to deal with. And then we looked at slope. So we wanted to use soil, elevation, and slope. And in slope, we compared 3 breaks, 0 to 6, 6 to 18, and over 18 degrees. We looked at 4 slope breaks. And then we looked at a combination of slope and aspect, which we thought would be really good. But actually, when we did our comparisons, we found that vegetation split out better, at least the vegetation maps we had, with 3 slope breaks. So we overlaid soil order, elevation, and slope breaks to create our land facets. So this is simply a map of the elevation showing the 6 elevation breaks, blue and yellow. They're out of order, I apologize. Blue and yellow are the lowest elevation, and white and gray are the highest elevation. We overlaid on top of this slope. So the white areas are very gentle slope or flat. Central Washington, where there's a lot of agriculture, a good example of that. The high desert in southern Oregon is a good example. And then black is greater than 18 degrees, and obviously that reflects where we have mountainous terrain. And then we also overlaid soil order. And this is the map of soil orders. So when you overlay all of these 3 types on top of each other, you end up with land facets. And it kind of looks like a vegetation map in a way. And it identified 121 different land facets. So that was 121 different combinations of elevation, slope, and soil. There are a lot more combinations, but 121 actually occurred within this region. And so our interest then would be in thinking about assumption 1 here. Our interest would be in thinking about protecting a certain percentage of each of these land facets. And if we look at it at the land facets in the same way we looked at communities in our ecoregional assessment, we set 30% as a goal for communities, 30% of the existing distribution. Maybe we could set 30% of each of these land facets in each ecoregion as a goal for conservation. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but when you overlay vegetation onto these land facets, you see things like in the land facet that is composed of aridosols at a moderate elevation, relatively high elevation, and shallow slopes, 63% of that land facet, and that land facet is almost 7 million hectares in size, 63% of that land facet is covered by big sage brush shrublands. When you look at mollisols that are at low elevation and flat, you can see that 54% of that land facet, which is pretty big, 2.3 million hectares, 54% of it is actually in agriculture. So you're starting to look at impact associated with land use. I'm going to skip over this. So as I said, the assumption is that by protecting key land facets and evaluating occurrences of those land facets with characteristics that buffer against climate change, we can identify representative settings that are the most resilient. So we want to capture maybe 30% at a minimum of each of these. This is just hypothetical. But we want to decide where that 30% should be. And as I said earlier, we want to make sure that 30% represent sites that have characteristics that would make them, in and of themselves, resilient to climate change. So we mapped wall to wall across this entire area microclimate diversity at a scale of 30 meters, 30 meter pixel, so it's pretty fine scale. And We did that directly. Some people have done that just by adding up the number of land types within a certain area. But here we're assuming that species are currently inhabiting climatic niches that are suitable to them, and that they will disperse to the best of their ability into nearby areas with suitable microclimate in response to climate change. We decided to use direct measures, two direct measures, using a compound topographic index, which is a surrogate for soil moisture, and that can be easily calculated. So we mapped that, and we mapped heat load index, which is a surrogate for, did I say temperature for compound topographic index? It's moisture. Compound topographic index is a surrogate for moisture. Heat load index is a surrogate for temperature. Requires only 2 data inputs, requires a 30-meter digital elevation map, and requires a land cover data. So it's very easy to do, and it runs within Esri's suite of tools. I say it's very easy to do, but I can't do it, but a GIS person could. So mapping microclimate diversity, we end up with maps like this. I won't get into detail here, but we're really looking at diversity, not that is within a certain area, what is the range of HLI or heat load index values? And within a certain area, what is the range of moisture values based on compound topographic index? And we combine those together, and we end up with a microclimate diversity map of the entire region, where brown is lower diversity, microclimate diversity, green is higher, and it's obvious that where you had very low slopes, shallow slopes, your microclimate diversity is lower, and where you have steeper slopes and mountains, microclimate diversity is higher. But if you look down into river valleys and things like that, you will find higher microclimate diversity. Then permeability, we wanted to calculate permeability to make sure that areas that did have high microclimate diversity were permeable to species movement. And we did that using a process called resistant kernel. And what the resistant kernel does is for each 90-meter pixel, in this case 90-meter pixel, it represents how connected that 90-meter pixel cell is to all the surrounding 90-meter pixels around it, up to a distance of 3 kilometers, 3 kilometers radius. So essentially it's asking the question, to what extent are ecological flows outward from that cell, from that 90-meter pixel, impeded or facilitated by the surrounding landscape? And it's simply a way to get at how fragmented or unfragmented the landscape is. And I won't go into any more detail to it than that. But results, when applied to a satellite image of Idaho, I think this is the Snake River Basin, mountains up here, river down here with a lot of development and agriculture. When resistant kernel is applied to this, the permeability map looks like this. So white and pink are not very permeable at all, and green to yellow are more permeable. So just flipping back and forth, you can see the difference. So the permeability map across the entire region looks like this, and it really is reflecting land use. So this may be flat, but there's not a lot of alternative land uses in this area. And when you combine permeability and microclimate diversity, you end up with resilience. And this then is a map of the resilient landscapes across the entire 69 million hectare area. And it is stratified by ecoregions and ecofacets. So it's really comparing resilience high and low within an ecoregion, and not just across the whole ecoregion. So it's comparing flat areas with flat areas and mountainous areas with mountainous areas. So this work is in a report that can be found on Conservation Gateway, and Duncan sent out a link to the site. This is the site where you can find it, and a good link is also nature.ly/resilience with a capital N and a capital W, and you can get to the report, and you can actually download the entire geodatabase, which is 3.3 gigabytes. You can also go to the eastern U.S. and download all of their information, too. Now, the work I just described was done here in the Pacific Northwest. We are just finishing up a similar assessment west of the Cascades. All of this area in green and very soon the light green has been done in the eastern part of North America, including some of the Canadian provinces. And we have received funding to do the work in the Great Plains and the Great Lakes areas. Each of the names here represents an ecoregion. So in this case, you see that they are actually going into Canada. So methods will be modified or tweaked if needed to address data available in the Canadian provinces. So I think that is great, and we'll keep an eye on that. And with what they learn up here, we can then apply it, I hope, over here to round out the Canadian Rockies. So questions. I have very little time. I'm not going to entertain any questions, but I wanted to quickly get into how this information is being used in conservation planning. The first question, I guess, is we do have this portfolio of conservation sites that were developed based on biodiversity, that were developed for each of the ecoregions. Do these portfolio sites actually capture 30% of the resilient land facets already? And so we overlaid our portfolio onto the resilience map, the land facet map, and we find out that in the Canadian Rockies, if we set a goal of 30% representation, 100% of the land facets had 30% of their area included in the portfolio. And the portfolio is pretty large north of the U.S. border too. So I bet this 100% is the same for Canada. But how about resilient examples? For resilient examples of these ecofacets, it's the same. 100% of resilient examples of these ecofacets had 30% of their area captured within the Canadian Rockies portfolio. The other way we can use this is to just look at how resilient conservation portfolio sites are. Again, we can overlay portfolio on resilience map, and this is a map simply of portfolio sites coded by how resilient they are. The ones that are in teal are the most resilient, and you could potentially work on those first if you're looking at conservation activity. We can use the resilience information to update ecoregional assessments. Ecoregional assessments were done based on meeting goals for biodiversity. So we tested this in southeastern Oregon. We redid a biodiversity-based assessment in southeastern Oregon and came up with this portfolio, these light green areas, that covered 39% of the project area and met 100% of the biodiversity goals, 79% of the land facet goals. But if we use land facets as a target along with biodiversity, you end up with this portfolio, which is pretty similar, that meets 100% of the goals for land facets, 100% of the goals for biodiversity, and still only covers 41% of the project area. The biodiversity one only covered 39%, so not much of a difference. We could use resilience to inform conservation and management actions on public land. If they're dealing with an area that is shown as resilient, we could be working with public agencies to make sure they minimize fragmentation within those areas. In the Northeast, U.S., any new acquisition projects have to be put through a resilience filter to see how resilient they are. And last but not least, and I'm out of time, darn it, but this is the last one, we shouldn't be saying that all land facets are the same. Some of them are very well protected already, and some of them are threatened. And so we took an approach and mapped conservation risk index that looked at how converted a land facet was versus how protected that land facet was, and identifies those land facets that are overconverted and underprotected. And so we considered anything that was overconverted and underprotected had an index of greater than 1. This is simply a map of conservation protection status, 0 being private, 1 and 2 being areas that are protected and managed for biodiversity, 3 being public land with multiple use management, and 4 being tribal land and Air Force bases. If we ask which of the land facets in each of the ecoregions are underprotected and overconverted, we end up with this map. If we then ask, well, which landscapes within these impacted or underprotected ecofacets are resilient, we end up with this map. If we then take out, and the colors here represent, again, the protection status. If we take out anything that really is protected, this is protected up here, this is protected down here, we end up with this. Now, we're not interested in just protecting something based on its geophysical characteristics, but we also want to look at its biodiversity significance. So we overlay portfolio sites on this so we can identify resilient areas that are underprotected but are important in terms of biodiversity. And just pop up a few areas. We have the Lawrence grassland that is underprotected. Most of the land is privately owned in the Brown, and so it's a great opportunity for conservation acquisition. We have Kootenai area, Kootenai River site or Kootenai Valley, and there is a lot of land that is publicly owned here in green, but some privately owned area too. So this could be a focus for private land conservation and for working with public agencies to not fragment land in the other parts of those sites. And I will stop there. And I don't have a good summary, but I think that you can see that this resilience information, which is based on non-climatic data, non-climatic modeling, is a reasonable tool, not the only tool certainly, to help inform conservation in the face of climate change. And we're definitely doing that and applying it now across the U.S. and up into Canada. So I will stop there, and I urge anyone who is interested, we don't have any time left, but I urge anyone who is interested in asking me questions to contact me at this email address above, sbuttrick@tnc.org, or my direct telephone line is 801-8120. Okay, that's it. Sorry, Duncan.
No, that's fine, and yeah, thanks so much, Steve. I find it's so interesting, and this is a great lens to view conservation. and resilience in this region. So we'll have the webinar available. It's been recorded and it'll be on kootenaiconservation.ca. As Steve said, if you have questions, feel free to get a hold of him directly, or you can reach me at Duncan@kootenaiconservation.ca. So thanks again, and yeah, hopefully everybody can tune in for our next webinar or webinars. The next one will be in January on freshwater storytelling. So thanks again, Steve, and thanks to everybody for participating today.
Sure. Duncan, were there any questions that were written out?
We had a few here, so if you'd like, I did get back to them and let them know that we could follow up with them.
That would be great, and if you could forward them to me, that would be great, and who sent them.
Will do, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, everybody.